Today we are going to be moving on to our next lesson. So in your next blank page, open it up. It should be a right-hand page, so the spiral and the holes are on the left-hand side, and the title for today is Organizing Your Data. After you have the title written, we're going to copy down the focus question. So our focus question for today is, how do scientists organize data to make statements about relationships between variables? And a lot of the information that we're going to be covering today is in this packet that many of you did earlier in the month, actually last month, called Organizing Your Data. So for our notes, we are going to be making data tables and graphs throughout the rest of the year, and the point of them is to use to record and organize or communicate any data that you've collected in a experiment or a lab activity or something like that. And the first notes that I want you to take have to do with how a data table and a graph are not the same thing. So on the left side, I'm going to have you write data table. Make a little T-chart. On the right, you're going to write graphs. A data table usually looks something like this. You have a title, and then it's going to have different sections with your data in it. And a graph is going to look maybe like that, or you might have a bar graph like we made earlier in the year. So the first thing that you need to kind of push into your brain is this idea that data tables and graphs are the same thing. It's a common misconception among students. They use the words interchangeably, but they are very, very different. So data tables is where I'm going next. Data tables need a title, column labels, and units. The whole point of the data table and the graph is to organize our independent and dependent variables. So I'm just going to really quick write those up here. We're going to be labeling them as IV and DV. So IV is our independent variable. It's what the researcher is changing on purpose. And the DV is the dependent variable. And that's what the researcher would measure or count. Okay. So the typical title format would be that it starts with table. And the format is typically the effect of the independent variable on dependent variable. The title goes at the top, nice and big. And the data table usually looks something like this. The column label will go here. And the other column label will go here. Your independent variable tends to be on the left-hand side. And then you usually have your dependent variable on this side, whatever you're measuring. And usually up at the top you would have the units as well. And so I'm just going to write an example. So let's say our independent variable is the amount of sunlight. And we are going to be measuring plant height. Then after that, I would put the unit in parentheses. So cm would be our units. Usually at the end is where you'd have calculations. So that's going to be your best value, uncertainty, etc. Just so it sticks out a little, I'm going to pick a colored pencil and just mark my examples, the amount of sunlight and the plant height. If I was writing those examples in this data table, they'd actually be up here. Okay. So my data table now has a title, the column labels are here, and then the units are right here. It is important to know that looking at a data table, the columns are what run up and down, and the rows are what go side to side. Now I'm going to look at graphs. I'm going to kind of wrap that around here. So our needs. They also need a title. They need labels for each axis. And units. So I'm going to do a little sample graph. The title for a graph is going to look very similar to the title that you would do for a table, but instead of starting with table, you're going to write graph. And we'll do again the effect of the independent variable on the dependent variable. And then depending on the experiment, you would change what you write here for IV and RV. So real quick for our example from above, I wrote the amount of sunlight and the plant height. So this data table would read the effect of the amount of sunlight on plant height. Okay. Here it would look exactly the same. So it'd say graph and then effect of amount of sunlight on plant height. So the way that we do it is that the dependent or responding variable goes on the y-axis. And if it's possible, you'd also write its unit. It won't always be possible that your dependent variable, your dependent variable will always have a unit. So you will always label the unit. sometimes it's not possible that your independent variable has a unit. So if I'm doing amount of sunlight and I'm just putting it in sun or partial shade, I wouldn't have a unit. If I was doing something where I was actually able to measure the amount of sunlight that the plant was receiving, then I could write down the unit there. One way that I remember this is a dry mix. And basically what that stands for is the dependent or responding variable goes on the y-axis, and the manipulated or independent variable goes on the x-axis. So if this again was our example, the amount of sunlight would go on the bottom. And that doesn't have a unit, so I would leave it there. If it doesn't have a unit, you're probably also looking at making a bar graph. But so the amount of sunlight would go there, and then on the left side would be where you'd have plant height in centimeters. Okay. So I'm going to shade that again the same color that I picked, just so that I get the idea that that's where that information would go. There are two different types of graphs that we're going to be using the most. So I'm just going to sketch really quick what that would look like. This type of graph is called a line graph. And a line graph is used for continuous change. So, for example, if I wanted to see how high my plant grew over time, time would be a continuous change. The other type of graph that we'll do, probably not as much because they're not quite as official, is a bar graph. And a bar graph is used for comparing. Okay. Now the practice you're going to get today is going to help you with all these parts, basically, to be able to come up with a title, to be able to come up with the column labels and units. You're going to be doing graphs. The data tables are already written for you. But I am going to ask you to label the dependent and independent variable and to come up with titles. So this is what your work is going to look like, and you're going to get 4 problems. For each of the problems, it's going to ask you independent variable, dependent variable, and to think of a title. And there's a few that ask you to calculate the average or the best value. Just to finish up my notes, I'm going to pick 2 different colors. I'm going to mark my data table notes in purple. Just want a way to kind of differentiate what I wrote here about data tables from what I wrote about graphs. So I'll zoom out so you can see what I'm doing. So my graphs are going to be here. And then my graph information is down here at the bottom. There you go. Once you've added the color, your notes are done, and you are going to get to do your practice.